All right, now to a topic that we're going to be discussing, I promise you, every week for the next 10 weeks at least, and probably beyond that, and that is the Memphis mayor's race. Let's show you a graphic we had made of all the 19 people that are now running for Memphis mayor. That is the final count, although I guess some people could still drop out or whatever. But the deadline came and went this week for people to file for the mayor's race. And before we get into specific candidates and where they stand right now, one big issue that's coming up is people realizing with 19 names on the ballot, it's going to be impossible for anyone to win with a majority of the vote. And that's because Memphis is one of the few cities that does not have a runoff. There are two ways to do that. You can have run a partisan primary where you have a Democrat and Republican running and then the top two finishers run against each other, the two nominees. Or it doesn't really matter about partisanship, which is what Memphis does now. But when you get it down to two, then they can run again and should run again in a runoff so that somebody has a plurality of the votes or 50% to win. We asked the incumbent, Mayor Jim Strickland, what he thinks about a mayoral runoff election, and here was his response.
I totally oppose partisan primaries, but I do think we ought to have a runoff. And I say this as a guy who, when I ran in 2015, I won by 20 percentage points, but I got 42% of the vote. I feel very confident that I would have won in a runoff, but it helps you serve if you get over 50% of the vote, because it does show you have a mandate. I felt I had a mandate, and by winning by 20 points, I think people kind of inherently felt it, but I think you govern better. Instead of winning with 30% of the vote, you get 55% of the vote. It just helps in governing, I believe.
I think his point is well taken. Of course, when he ran the second time, he got 62%, so he did get that majority or that mandate he was after. But I'll start with you on this one, Mayor Whalen. Mayor Whalen. I promoted you.
No, say that again.
Did you like the sound of it?
I didn't know you had gotten in the race. I'm excited.
Not this time.
I'm excited.
Reverend Whalen. What do you think about that?
Well, as you referred to it, as the person on this panel who tends to run for offices and tends to run as an outsider, I don't want the runoff. I want to be able to be the maverick. I want to be able to try to convince a majority of people to vote for me. That's probably not politically expedient, especially with regard to what Jim was saying about being able to govern after the election. But I think that's a part of the populace, the voting base being educated. Let them be the ones to decide who gets in the race, who stays in the race. And I know that's quixotic in terms of it's not ever going to happen, but personally, I don't like the runoff.
Well, Councilman J.B. Smiley is a big advocate for the runoff and points out that this election, we could have somebody with 20,000 votes or thereabouts representing a city with 630,000, 650,000 people, and just feels that that's just a joke.
Yeah, it's very unique, but my understanding is if you wanted to change it, you would actually have to go to federal court.
Go to federal court, that's right.
Back when Memphis, the city of Memphis, which is now maybe 25% white, in the late 80s, early 90s, it was just above 50%. And there was Voting Rights Act litigation because the plaintiffs believed that the white majority, just that very slim white majority, was excluding the black electorate from ever potentially electing a black mayor. And so there was a settlement, I believe, that's still, it's still binding. That's why we don't have a runoff. So you would actually have to go to federal court and get that undone in order to restructure it, which now it has almost the opposite effect, right? Because we're in a majority African-American city, and you could have a candidate that's white that could win with 20% of the vote, 25% of the vote. So sort of unintended consequences as demographic changes have progressed. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than just changing the city charter. I think you got to go and get the judge on the phone and figure out what he has to say about it.
Chris is exactly right about that from a historical standpoint. Of course, it was also Martavius Jones who, along with J.B. Smiley and maybe some others who wanted to have runoffs and partisan elections. I do think the mayor makes a good point here, but it is grounded in that history that goes back to 1991 when Judge Jerome Turner said that the runoffs were unconstitutional from that racial point of view. This played out in 1982 when we had a special election. G.O. Patterson Jr. got more votes than Dick Hackett and Mike Cody. They had to have a runoff, and it was Hackett and Patterson in the runoff, and Hackett beat him. So that is what led to that 1991 thing. I'm okay with asking to get out from under the no runoff provision, because I do think it's important that the mayor of this city have a 50% plus one a mandate from the voters. And so if there was a way to do that, I'm in favor of that. I'm not in favor of the partisan election.
I should have let the political historian actually do the political history
one who
part. Yeah, the
literally
one who
wrote
wrote the
the
book on it. I think that's where I got the
Let me
information.
add one
I read
thing.
the book.
Let me add one
Thank you so
thing.
much.
Let me add one thing. Listen, I think that it is what it is. We have to abide by the consequences of having 19 people in the race, and it puts on the majority of the city, the black majority, it puts on us to get our act together between elections, do the work that is necessary to bring people together and lift up a young generation who can govern, and then let it go that way.
Okay, well, we're not going to show all 19 names. We showed their faces. But I did want to talk about what we, as we watch this unfold, would say are maybe the two tiers of the candidates who are most likely to win. I think if you were in Vegas, you would put odds that on our first graphic here, that one of these four individuals will probably be the next mayor of Memphis based on the polling and based on the amount of money that they've raised so far. Paul Young, the head of the Downtown Memphis Commission, Floyd Bonner, the sheriff, former Mayor Willie Harrington, who's doing very well in the polls, not so well in fundraising, and doesn't care, by the way. We asked him about it. He thinks he's just fine. He's got any recognition. And Van Turner, the former Shelby County Commissioner and current head of the Memphis NAACP. Then we have the second tier, which is Frank Colvett, the current city councilman, J.W. Gibson, businessman from Memphis and former county commissioner, and school board member Michelle McKissick. So, first of all, do you gentlemen agree with those seven faces? And then just what would you assess as who might be a long shot favorite? Who do you think has got the win sales behind them?
I do agree with that assessment. I think those first four that you mentioned are the top tier, and the last three are the bottom tier. I said before, it's either between 6 and 8 serious candidates that voters need to look at. But we said last week, Richard, and I think we ought to say again, let's not sleep on Dr. Harrington. He doesn't need the money. He's got the name recognition. He's got the track record. Love him or hate him. But more people know who he is. And when there's not a clear front runner, Dr. Harrington kind of eases to the front in my mind.
Well, you know, who votes? Older women predominantly.
Yeah.
And when we talked to him this week, he says, I think I've got that category locked up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he has a real shot. I don't know how much of the polling to believe. It's so difficult. I will mention there was a poll that came out maybe last week where it put Frank or someone like Councilman Colvett at number 2, you know, in the 20s. Who knows? Who knows? But I think you're right. You have 6 to 8 candidates who are in that top tier. But it's anybody's game. I mean, someone could legitimately win with 20 or 25% of the vote. I think it's going to be very, very interesting. You touched on this a moment ago. This relationship between spending versus name ID, right? Because you have some folks who are raising a ton of money, but do they know everybody at the Whitehaven Christmas Parade? I don't know.
Right.
I'll tell you who does know everybody. Dr. Harrington.
Dr. Harrington.
Yeah.
Yeah, the full disclosure, I'm a supporter of Paul Young, but first of all, I think the tiering is absolutely accurate. The first 4, I think, are the top possible vote getters. But let me say this. I think that Dr. Harrington, Floyd Bonner, Van Turner, and to a lesser degree, Judge Joe Brown, are all fighting for the same type of voter, fighting for the vote from people who honor and revere civil rights methodology, that kind of thing. But I think other candidates can appeal to the LGBTQ community who are becoming more and more politically active, young white Republicans who came out in full support of the Justins, the representatives who were evicted from the House. And I think it's going to be interesting.
I do too. It'll be fascinating to watch. You have anything else you want to add, Otis? It sounded like you did.
No, I
Okay.
agree. I agree with that assessment as well. But I will say, and I don't mind saying that, I will not give Joe Brown any credibility in this election. Not at all.
I agree with you.
Hard to disagree with that. In fact, shame on you for bringing up the name.
That's right.
Did I bring his name up? Oh, yeah.
I'm teasing. I'm teasing. Yeah, well, the only polling I'm aware of was the Daily Memphian poll. I know they paid good money for it. It's a solid poll, crosstabs and the whole thing. Found 48% undecided. So that's what we
right.
that's the big number right
That's the
there.
takeaway number.
It
All
is.
right, when we come back, a little bit of presidential politics right after this.